In the winter of 1168, during the twilight years of the Heian period, Kyoto's imperial palace flickered beneath torchlight as snow drifted silently over the rooftops. Behind the vermilion gates, far from the elegant poetry gatherings and court musicians that later storytellers would romanticize, a young attendant named Michiori knelt on the cold wooden floor of Seryoden Hall. His hands shook not from the chill, but from the knowledge that tonight he would be summoned by one of the most powerful figures in the realm. It was the night he would cease to belong to himself. For the first time he would learn the true meaning of serving as a male concubine in the imperial court, a role invisible in official chronicles yet whispered about for centuries. To understand what happened to men like Michiori, one must first strip away the illusions that surround classical Japan. The Heian court, often portrayed as a refined world of aristocratic beauty, waka poetry, and lacquered screens, was also a world of strict hierarchies, ritual submission, and hidden abuses. The era's famous literature, such as the Tale of Genji, describes the emotional lives of courtiers but rarely acknowledges the darker institution of coerced male sexual service. Yet historical records, diaries, and temple petitions reveal that behind the elegance of the capital lay a system that exploited vulnerable young men, especially those from minor noble families who lacked political backing. The practice emerged gradually as the imperial household expanded in size and ceremonial complexity. At its center stood the emperor and the powerful Fujiwara clan, whose daughters became imperial consorts and whose sons dominated politics. Below them operated a network of attendants known as the wakashu, adolescent boys, whose duties ranged from music to personal service. These youths were prized for their beauty, their obedience, and their malleability in a system where political loyalty began with physical access. Though the term male concubine never appeared in official titles, diaries from court nobles imply that several wakashu served intimate roles for senior courtiers and occasionally members of the imperial family itself. By the mid-12th century, this structure hardened into an informal but brutal institution. Families struggling financially often sent their sons to the capital, hoping they might secure patronage. But patronage demanded submission, and submission came in many forms. Once a boy entered the inner palace, he could not easily leave. Many were bound by unwritten expectations that their bodies, like their labor, belonged to their superiors. Michiori's story followed this pattern. Born to a declining aristocratic lineage in Yamashiro province, his family could trace ancestry to ancient ministers, but now lived in modest poverty. His father, desperate to maintain prestige, accepted an offer from a Fujiwara middle, ranking noble. Michiori would be placed in palace service. The arrangement promised education, silk robes, and potential advancement. What his family did not know was that the Fujiwara noble had already heard rumors of Michiori's appearance, praised by a traveling monk who had visited the province. By the time the 15-year-old boy arrived in Kyoto, he was being quietly assessed as a potential personal attendant for one of the emperor's influential uncles. Inside the palace, life for young attendants looked orderly on the surface. They rose before dawn, recited ritual prayers, and performed domestic tasks such as preparing writing tools, carrying messages, organizing wardrobes, and accompanying nobles in ceremonies. They learned refined speech patterns, court etiquette, and how to move with the controlled grace expected of aristocratic servants. Their clothing, usually layered silk in soft colors, displayed not their freedom but their function. Beauty was a currency, and the palace knew how to harvest it. Yet beneath this cultivated environment lay an atmosphere of fear. Older attendants warned newcomers never to refuse a private summons. Refusal meant expulsion or worse, accusations of disloyalty. Court records include cases where attendants who resisted powerful patrons were dismissed with no stipend, causing disgrace for their families. More haunting are the accounts from monastic chronicles, where runaway youth sought sanctuary in temples and confessed the humiliations they endured. Though the language of these petitions is often indirect, the implications are unmistakable. Michiori's training period lasted 6 months. During this time, he learned how to remain silent, how to lower his eyes, how to interpret a court noble's slightest gesture. He learned that loyalty to one master was safer than attracting the attention of many, but he could not avoid attention. His delicate features, often complemented by older attendants, drew the gaze of the noble who had arranged his placement. That noble, seeking to increase his influence with the emperor's uncle, offered Michiori as a gift of service. The transaction was carried out discreetly. No document recorded it, but everyone involved understood what it meant. On the night he was summoned for the first time, Michiori walked through the silent wing of the palace, with a senior attendant guiding him. The air was heavy with incense, and the distant sound of court musicians practicing in another hall felt like a cruel contrast to the dread tightening in his chest. The senior attendant, who had long accepted the inevitability of such duties, offered only one piece of advice. Surrendering without resistance brought fewer punishments. In many societies throughout history, male concubinage remained a hidden but not uncommon practice, from Ottoman harems to Korean courts during the Goryeo dynasty. But in Japan, the combination of strict hierarchy, ritual secrecy, and the cultural value placed on youthful beauty created a particularly oppressive environment. While women's experiences in similar roles have been widely studied, the suffering of male attendants has often been overshadowed by romanticized versions of Japanese court culture. As Michiori entered the private residence of the emperor's uncle, he stepped into a world where power was absolute. This noble, a man in his late 30s, controlled vast estates, commanded political alliances, and had the authority to shape the lives of dozens of attendants. In his presence, Michiori was expected to exist not as a person, but as property. What unfolded over the following months would define the rest of his life and illustrate, with painful clarity, the hidden cruelties embedded in the elegant world of the Heian court. This system did not arise from individual cruelty alone. It was supported by political structures, reinforced by cultural norms, and justified by the belief that beauty and service were interchangeable. Michiori's suffering was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a broader pattern in which young men, trapped between family expectations and political ambition, were sacrificed to the demands of powerful elites. The turning point in Michiori's life came in early 1169, during the start of the Koka era, a time when political storms were rumbling beneath the surface of Kyoto's refined court. The Taira clan was rising rapidly, the Fujiwara were struggling to retain influence, and the emperor's relatives maneuvered for every advantage. In this climate of shifting power, human lives at the bottom of the hierarchy were traded silently like pieces on a board. Michiori, only 16 and still adapting to the rituals of palace life, became one such piece in a game he barely understood. After his first summons to the residence of the emperor's uncle, there was no return to ordinary duties. His schedule changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. He was reassigned from the communal quarters of lower attendants to a secluded wing reserved for personal retainers of high-ranking nobles. The corridors here were quieter, the servants fewer, the rules more severe. Senior stewards guarded the entrances at all hours, and while the environment appeared serene, it was in truth a controlled and isolating space designed to limit contact with the outside world. It was in this wing that the consequences of his new role became clear. Michiori's tasks were no longer simple administrative duties or ceremonial assistance. He became responsible for preparing the personal chambers of the noble, arranging robes, mixing perfumes, and standing silently beside the master during gatherings or private meetings. These duties were the public face of his service. The private side was understood without words. He was expected to be present whenever summoned, regardless of the hour, and to fulfill whatever demands were made of him. Among attendants it was called night duty, a term that concealed the fear and humiliation attached to it. Life in the palace moved according to strict ritual rhythms, but for concubine attendants, those rhythms were dictated entirely by the needs of their patron. If the noble grew anxious due to political pressures, Michiori's presence was required for comfort. If the noble celebrated a victory at court, Michiori was summoned for companionship. The boy's existence became a constant performance, shaped not by his own wishes, but by the emotional tides of a man who wielded near absolute control over him. Historical diaries from the period hint at such relationships, though they veil the realities behind poetic language. Court nobles wrote of beautiful youths who pleased their lords, of attendants who stayed close during banquets, and of personal retainers whose loyalty was rewarded with silk or land. But beneath this refined phrasing lay an unspoken truth. Many of these youths had no choice. Their families had offered them in desperation, and once inside the palace, honor demanded obedience. Any sign of reluctance was seen as a stain on the family name. Michiori's days began before sunrise. He would kneel by a water basin, washing his face with cold water, then dress in layered silk robes chosen not for comfort but for appearance. He was taught how to apply light fragrance to his sleeves, how to smooth his movements when approaching a noble, and how to smile faintly at appropriate moments. His teachers were older attendants who had survived years of similar service. Their advice was quiet but firm. Preserve your composure, avoid eye contact with jealous rivals, never show fear in front of the master. These older attendants played a critical role in maintaining the system. Some did so reluctantly, having once suffered as Michiori did. Others had internalized the palace hierarchy, believing their survival depended on enforcing the same rules they once endured. They ensured Michiori learned the unspoken code of the inner residence. He was warned not to form close friendships, as jealous informants could twist harmless conversations into accusations of disloyalty. He was warned not to speak of his duties outside his wing, as revealing secrets could endanger his family. Above all, he was warned that refusal of a command from the noble would not only ruin him, but could bring shame upon his entire lineage. As weeks turned into months, Michiori experienced the psychological toll of this captivity. The palace was beautiful, with painted screens, polished floors, and lanterns casting warm glows during evening banquets. But for him, beauty became a cage. He moved through the halls like a shadow, always present, yet never acknowledged beyond his role. He learned to smile when spoken to bow deeply, to remain silent even when insulted by drunk courtiers during feasts. His emotions were not his own to express. Even fear had to be hidden behind a polite mask. Historical scholars have long debated the extent to which male concubinage shaped court politics in the late Heian period. While direct evidence is limited due to the taboo nature of the topic, a number of aristocratic diaries reveal recurring patterns. Senior nobles frequently kept youthful attendants for personal pleasure. Patronage networks were often intertwined with these relationships, and families sought to position their sons advantageously despite the risks. In some cases, favored attendants gained promotions or small estates, but the majority remained trapped in a cycle of service that offered little long-term stability. For Michiori, the prospect of advancement existed only as a distant, fragile hope. Sometimes the noble expressed fondness for him, gifting him a finely dyed robe or allowing him to accompany the household on a pilgrimage to a nearby temple. These gestures, however, were not acts of kindness but of possession. The robes marked him as the noble's property, the trips served as displays of the noble's taste, and any praise he received reinforced the idea that his worth lay not in his character or abilities, but in his obedience and appearance. The noble's household also included other youths who had once served similar roles. Some had aged beyond the preferred years of the patron and were gradually reassigned to clerical tasks or administrative work. These men viewed Michiori with mixed emotions. Some pitied him, recognizing the fear in his eyes. Others grew hostile, seeing him as a rival for influence or affection. Palace gossip was vicious. A simple rumor could pit attendants against each other, and accusations of misconduct carried severe consequences. The darkest aspect of this world was the constant insecurity. Unlike formal ranks in the court bureaucracy, the status of a male concubine was not protected by law. If a noble grew displeased or bored, he could dismiss the youth without explanation. Some attendants were quietly expelled from the capital, returning to their families in shame. Others turned to monastic life, seeking refuge in temples. A few disappeared from the records entirely. For Michiori, each day felt like walking along the edge of a blade. His patron held enormous political power, but power was unstable. The rise of the Taira clan threatened many Fujiwara allies, and the noble to whom Michiori belonged faced increasing pressure at court. When tensions escalated, the noble's temper grew unpredictable. The nights became more frightening. The demands increased. Small mistakes led to harsh reprimands. On more than one occasion, Michiori was ordered to kneel for hours as punishment for imagined disrespect. This pattern of escalating abuse is reflected in several historical documents from the late Heian and early Kamakura periods, where former attendants described similar cycles. The more politically threatened a noble became, the more violently he asserted control over those beneath him. Personal attendants bore the brunt of that struggle. By the end of 1169, Michiori had lost the last remnants of his childhood innocence. He had learned to anticipate his patron's moods, to remain awake during long hours of night duty, and to hide bruises beneath his robes when appearing at morning rituals. His voice grew quieter, his posture more restrained. He was becoming exactly what the palace wanted, a silent, beautiful ornament serving the desires of the powerful. But change was coming. The political climate of Kyoto was shifting rapidly, and the rise of a new power would soon bring up upheaval that threatened not only nobles and ministers, but also the hidden world of concubine attendants. Michiori's fate would be tied to these events in ways he could not yet imagine. By the spring of 1170, Kyoto was no longer the serene center of aristocratic poetry and ritualized elegance it pretended to be. A quiet tension vibrated through the capital. Rumors spread across the wooden corridors of the Imperial palace, whispered by servants, courtiers, and monks who traveled between temples and noble estates. The Taira clan, under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, was rising with unprecedented momentum. Their influence stretched from the imperial council to the military garrisons, and every noble family, especially the Fujiwara, felt the pressure. For Michiori, the shifting political tide was more than a distant development. It seeped into the fabric of his daily life, shaping the moods, temper, and paranoia of the noble he served. His patron, once confident and arrogant, began to show signs of fear. Messages arrived day and night. Envoys came privately to discuss court alliances, and the noble's voice, once calm and composed, grew sharp, layered with anxiety. Every time his authority was questioned in court, he returned home unsettled, making new demands on the attendants who had no power except to endure. Concubine attendants were the most vulnerable in times of political instability. They were not protected by rank or family name once placed under a noble's personal authority. Their value depended entirely on the whims of their patron. If a noble fell from favor, his attendants often became collateral victims, dismissed, reassigned, abandoned, sometimes worse. For Michiori, the warning signs appeared gradually. His patron's summons became more frequent. Nights grew longer. Harsh punishments increased for trivial matters. A misplaced incense burner, a crooked fold in a robe, a hesitant response to a command. Anything could provoke the noble's anger, which now simmered dangerously close to the surface. But the true turning point came with the arrival of a new youth from a powerful provincial family. The boy, barely 15, was brought to the residence by a Taira official seeking to build ties with the noble. He was handsome, confident, and accompanied by servants carrying gifts. His presence signaled an alliance, but for Michiori it meant something else, a rival. It was common for high-ranking nobles to maintain several attendants of varying status. But when political tensions intensified, competition among these attendants could turn ruthless. Privileges such as sleeping quarters, clothing, or participation in rituals became points of rivalry. Some attendants attempted to sabotage others. Some spread whispers. Some displayed forced loyalty to secure their position. The new youth, named Masataka, quickly gained the noble's attention. Michiori noticed how the noble smiled more warmly when Masataka served tea, how he softened his tone when the boy approached, how he praised the youth's elegance and obedience. Michiori had once received such praise. That time was fading. From that moment, the painful truth of the concubine system revealed itself. A youth's entire worth depended on remaining desirable in the eyes of his master. Beauty, submission, silence. Any decline in these qualities placed him at risk. Being replaced meant more than emotional pain. It meant sudden vulnerability. The noble's household began to shift its internal hierarchy. Masataka was given new robes in deeper colors, a sign of favor. He accompanied the noble to daytime ceremonies, a privilege Michiori once held. He was invited to banquets, allowed to sit closer to the noble in his private chambers. The household stewards, always eager to support whichever attendant held the most influence, began treating Michiori with subtle coldness. The humiliation was sharp, but the danger was sharper. In the palace, once a concubine lost favor, he was often expelled without support. Some were sent back to impoverished families who could not protect them. Others were transferred to lower-ranking nobles, where the conditions were harsher. Historical diaries even mention attendants who took desperate measures, fleeing to monasteries or attempting to disappear into the city, where survival was difficult for anyone born into aristocratic life. Michiori's fall accelerated when Masataka began manipulating the noble's emotions. He whispered complaints about Michiori's supposed disobedience. He implied that Michiori conversed too freely with other attendants. He accused him of failing to show proper reverence during rituals. None of these claims were true, but truth mattered little. A favorite's words held more weight than a discarded youth's silence. By summer, Michiori's duties were reduced to menial tasks. He was no longer allowed to accompany the noble to council meetings or private outings. His nights were still commanded, but his days were filled with humiliation. Older attendants who had once guided him now avoided eye contact, afraid to be associated with someone falling out of favor. The loneliness grew suffocating. Then came the scandal that shattered what remained of his protection. One evening, during a private gathering attended by the noble, several Fujiwara allies, and a few Taira observers, an argument erupted over a political decision regarding the imperial regency. Voices rose. Accusations were exchanged. The noble, already unstable from months of stress, reacted violently. He struck one of the Fujiwara guests, an act considered outrageous even within private walls. The Taira observers quietly took note. The incident might have been contained if not for Masataka. The youth, eager to distance himself from the noble's growing downfall, claimed that Michiori had played a role in aggravating the situation. He suggested Michiori had delivered messages incorrectly, misled the noble about the guest's intentions, and caused confusion before the argument. The allegation was absurd, yet it reached the ears of powerful men. Within days, whispers circulated through the palace. A young attendant had sown discord. A concubine had overstepped his boundaries. A servant had manipulated noble emotions. These rumors were dangerous. In Heian society, attendants blamed for political missteps often faced severe punishment. Some were beaten, some were cast out, Others were quietly removed from the record, their names erased from household registries. Michiori was summoned to the noble's private chamber for questioning. The noble, already paranoid, did not allow him to speak in his defense. Instead, he declared Michiori disloyal, disobedient, tainted. This judgment, spoken in front of senior stewards, became official in practice, if not in writing. The punishment was swift. Michiori was stripped of his finer robes, reassigned to an isolated storage quarter, and forbidden from entering the noble's private residence. He lost his sleeping mat, his decorative sashes, even the right to stand in ceremonial halls. He became invisible, but the worst punishment was yet to come. The noble, seeking to protect himself from political fallout, decided to offer Michiori as a scapegoat. He blamed the servant for miscommunications that had led to the scandal. To purge any stain from his household, he ordered that Michiori be removed from service. Whether the youth would be dismissed peacefully or subjected to harsher measures depended on the stewards. Historical accounts from this period describe several fates for disgraced concubine attendants. Some were sent back to their families in disgrace. Others were sold into labor under minor officials. A few were transferred to remote estates, where life was unbearably harsh. Some never made it that far. Michiori now stood at the edge of this precipice. His fall from grace was complete. The palace that once promised advancement now threatened to swallow him. The noble who once summoned him nightly now acted as though the boy had never existed. The attendants who once envied him now regarded him with fear, as though his misfortune might spread like a plague. And behind all this, unseen but looming, the rise of the Taira clan would soon transform the entire structure of Heian society. Their ascendancy would bring war, the end of old court traditions, and the collapse of institutions that had supported systems like concubinage for generations. For Michiori, survival depended on what happened next. Either someone intervened, or he would vanish into the shadows of history like countless forgotten youths before him. Autumn of 1170 arrived with cold winds sweeping across Kyoto, scattering red maple leaves through the palace courtyards. The beauty of the season contrasted brutally with the fear that now consumed Michiori's life. His days, once spent in silk robes and polished corridors, were reduced to silent labor in dim storage rooms. His nights were restless, haunted by the knowledge that any moment could bring the news of his expulsion, or worse, a punishment carried out quietly behind palace walls. The palace had countless corners where unwanted attendants disappeared from the narrative. The noble he once served no longer acknowledged his existence. The new favorite Masataka occupied the privileged role Michiori once held, and with that power he reinforced the narrative of Michiori's supposed disloyalty. The stewards, eager to stay aligned with the noble's shifting preferences, treated Michiori as though he carried a contagion. No one spoke to him unless necessary. Few dared to stand near him. Even younger attendants, once fascinated by him, now avoided him nervously. The humiliation was profound, but humiliation was not the true danger. The imminent collapse of Michiori's protection meant he was at the mercy of decisions made by powerful men who cared nothing for the well-being of a disgraced youth. The noble decided that removing Michiori from the palace would restore the household's image, but in the intricate politics of the court, dismissal was not a simple matter. Every action carried meaning. Sending him directly home to his family might imply guilt. Ordering a punishment could attract attention. The noble needed a solution that would erase the problem without creating noise. The stewards devised one. Michiori was to be transferred to a remote estate under the control of a regional official loyal to the noble. Such transfers were common for attendants deemed troublesome. Many found themselves working agricultural land or serving in small manor houses far from the capital. For someone trained in court life, this was equivalent to exile. For Michiori, the decision felt like a slow death. The day the transfer order was announced, Michiori stood silently before a steward who delivered the news with cold efficiency. He was told to prepare only the belongings he had brought from his provincial home years earlier. The silk robes gifted by the noble were taken back. His accessories, his scented sleeves, even his sandals made for ceremonial occasions were reclaimed by the household. He was no longer a court attendant, he was a discarded ornament, but fate rarely follows the intentions of powerful men. On the night before his scheduled departure, a senior attendant named Shojun sought him out. Shojun had served the noble for nearly a decade, and had endured the same hidden life Michiori once lived. He had aged beyond the years of desirability, and now worked as a steward overseeing household tasks. He had watched Michiori's rise and fall with the painful recognition of someone who had lived through the same cycle. After ensuring no one else was present, he whispered to Michiori for the first time in months. He revealed that the transfer order was not a simple reassignment. The remote estate to which Michiori was being sent had a reputation. Several attendants who had been exiled there over the years had never returned. Some were reported dead from illness, some vanished from the records altogether. Shojun believed the noble intended to dispose of him quietly. This revelation shook Michiori to his core. For months he had feared disgrace, but not death. Now he understood the severity of his situation. His patron, desperate to erase any connection to the scandal, had chosen the harshest solution available without drawing attention. Shojun, moved by compassion, and perhaps by the memory of his own suffering, offered a risky alternative. He had contacts among monks at a small temple near the southern edge of the capital. These monks quietly sheltered runaway servants, political refugees, and displaced youths. If Michiori left before dawn, he could reach the temple and claim sanctuary. Within temple walls, imperial authority held less power. Tradition dictated that even nobles hesitated to violate sacred spaces. But escape was dangerous. Palace guards patrolled the outer gates. Unauthorized departure could lead to severe punishment if intercepted. Yet staying meant a worse fate. After years of silent endurance, Michiori faced a crossroads. When dawn approached, he made his decision. Shojun provided him with plain robes, the type worn by low-ranking servants, and a wide bamboo hat that concealed much of his face. He instructed Michiori to walk with a slow, confident pace, as those who hurried attracted suspicion. The palace, sprawling in size but full of blind corners, had routes known only to household staff. Using these paths, Shojun guided him close to an auxiliary gate, then slipped away before guards could suspect interaction. Michiori stepped into the early light, heart pounding, and approached the gate. A guard glanced at him, but saw only an unremarkable servant leaving on an errand. The bamboo hat hid the youthful beauty that had once trapped him. With a curt nod, the guard let him pass. No alarm sounded. No footsteps followed. For the first time since entering the palace as a child, Michiori walked freely. He avoided main streets, choosing narrow lanes that wound around workshops, shrines, and small rice shops preparing for the morning crowds. Kyoto, when seen from outside palace walls, felt overwhelmingly vast. Merchants called out prices, children played near wells, monks swept temple courtyards. Life continued, unconcerned with the suffering hidden behind noble estates. By midday, he reached the temple Shojun had described. A weathered wooden gate stood open, revealing a courtyard filled with moss and quiet stone lanterns. A monk tending to the garden looked up as Michiori approached. He did not question the boy's identity or his purpose. Sanctuary, once requested, was rarely denied. Inside the temple, Michiori collapsed from exhaustion. For days he slept fitfully, waking from nightmares of palace corridors and whispered accusations. But slowly, the rhythms of temple life began to soothe the turmoil within him. Monks offered him rice, water, and simple robes. No one demanded anything of him. No one summoned him at night. No one struck him for mistakes. Yet safety did not erase the past. Michiori carried years of trauma that shaped his every thought. He struggled with guilt, fear, and the haunting belief that he remained marked by the noble's judgment. The monks, familiar with the suffering of displaced attendants, guided him through rituals meant to restore a sense of self. They encouraged him to copy sutras, draw water from the well, and walk meditation paths at dawn. In those moments, he began to reclaim fragments of identity lost to the palace. Outside the temple walls, the political world changed rapidly. By 1171, the Taira clan had consolidated power, and many Fujiwara nobles fell into obscurity. The noble who once owned Michiori faced consequences for his scandal and eventually lost influence. His household dissolved after his fall from grace. Masataka, deprived of a powerful patron, was reassigned to a minor post far outside Kyoto. The system that had trapped Michiori did not disappear, but the upheaval weakened the traditions sustaining it. As warfare erupted in the following decades, aristocratic institutions collapsed, and military rule replaced court dominance. Male concubinage, once a hidden but constant aspect of palace life, became far less common as the samurai class reshaped Japanese society. Michiori lived quietly within the temple for years, neither returning to his family nor seeking revenge. He found solace in anonymity. The monks treated him not as a former concubine, nor as a disgraced attendant, but simply as a young man seeking peace. His story, like those of countless others who served silently in palace shadows, never entered official chronicles. But fragments of similar lives survive in temple petitions, diaries, and whispered traditions. They reveal that behind the elegance of classical Japan existed a world of exploitation rarely acknowledged. Michiori's survival was rare. Many never escaped. Many never found sanctuary. Many vanished without record. His life stands as a reminder that the most refined societies often conceal the darkest human suffering beneath layers of beauty, ritual, and silence.